Welcome to Heartline Stories. Today's story follows a millionaire who hires a maid, only to recognize her as his former teacher. What happens next will shock you. A life-changing encounter brings them face to face with the past. But will it end in regret or a surprising new beginning? Let us know where you're watching from and stay tuned for the unexpected twists ahead. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories. James had always been a successful businessman. He built his company from the ground up and now enjoyed the fruits of his hard work. With a large mansion and a family to take care of, James was used to having people come and go. One afternoon, as he returned home from work, he noticed a new maid cleaning the living room. She had her head down, focusing on her tasks. Her uniform was neat, and she moved quickly and efficiently. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, but as James passed by her, something stopped him. There was something familiar about her. He stopped in his tracks and stared at her for a moment. The maid looked up, sensing his gaze. That's when it hit him. The woman in front of him was no stranger. She was Mrs. Thompson, his high school history teacher. He remembered her clearly, the way she taught with so much passion, the way she smiled and made everyone feel special. He couldn't believe his eyes. How had she ended up here, working as a maid in his mansion? James stood there, his mind racing with questions. He had always admired Mrs. Thompson. She was the one who had encouraged him to push through tough times and never give up on his dreams. Her lessons had shaped him into the man he was today. But why was she working as a maid? James took a deep breath and walked toward her. Mrs. Thompson looked up, her eyes widening when she saw him. He took another step closer, trying to find the words to speak. Was she doing this by choice? Did she need help? Mrs. Thompson, however, lowered her head, a hint of sadness crossing her face. James was unsure what to do next. What had happened to her? Why was she here? As he stood there struggling with his thoughts, Mrs. Thompson quickly turned away and resumed her cleaning. She seemed embarrassed and trying to hide from him, but James could sense the quiet pain in her eyes. James didn't know how to react. He had so many questions but didn't want to make her uncomfortable. After all, she had been an important figure in his life. But then he noticed something. There was a small tear in the sleeve of her uniform. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes about her circumstances. James was no longer just a businessman. He was now the man who had a responsibility to help someone who had shaped his future. James couldn't stop thinking about the situation. He paced around the house, unsure of how to approach Mrs. Thompson. She had always been an inspiring figure in his life, and now here she was, in front of him, working as a maid. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to find out why she was in this position. She had given him so much guidance during his school years, and now he wanted to return the favor. The next morning, as James sat at the kitchen table, he saw Mrs. Thompson entering with a tray of coffee. She looked at him with her usual quiet grace, but her eyes seemed different this time. Distant, guarded. James knew that now was the time. He had to speak up, even if it was uncomfortable. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice gentle. She froze for a moment but then turned to him, waiting. "Why are you working here? I mean, I don't understand. You were such an important person in my life. Why are you doing this?" Mrs. Thompson took a slow breath and placed the tray down. She hesitated before answering, as though weighing her words carefully. She finally met his gaze, but her expression was filled with quiet sadness. "I never wanted you to see me like this, James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Life didn't turn out the way I planned." James leaned forward, eager to understand more, but he could see that Mrs. Thompson was struggling. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the napkin on the tray. It was clear she was carrying a heavy burden, one that she had kept hidden for so long. "I had to start over," she continued, her voice shaky. "After my husband passed away, everything changed. I lost everything. My house, my job, my savings. I couldn't keep up anymore. So I took this job." James felt a wave of shock wash over him. He never could have imagined the challenges she had been facing. Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had always seemed so strong and confident in class, had been struggling in ways he couldn't have known. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to show weakness. James was silent for a moment. He didn't know how to respond, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew that he couldn't let this go. She had given him so much, and now he wanted to give back. "I want to help," James said, his voice steady. "Let me do something for you. I can't just stand by and let you suffer." Mrs. Thompson shook her head quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the offer. "James, please. I don't want any pity. I just, I just need to get through this on my own." But James could see the struggle in her eyes. He knew that pride had kept her from asking for help. Still, he couldn't let her go on like this. "I insist," James said softly, yet firmly. "You don't need to do this alone anymore. Whatever you need, whether it's a job, financial support, or just someone to listen, I'll be here." Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and nodded, a small but grateful smile crossing her face. "Thank you," she whispered. James smiled back, feeling a sense of relief. He knew that this was the right thing to do. He couldn't let the woman who had shaped his future live in such hardship. But even as he made this promise, he couldn't help but wonder what else Mrs. Thompson had been hiding. What else could he do to help her, to make things right? As James watched her leave the room, he realized that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. James sat at the table, his mind racing with possibilities. He wanted to help Mrs. Thompson more than anything. But what could he do to truly change her situation? He didn't know how long she had been struggling, but he knew he couldn't just offer her a one-time gesture of kindness. As he thought about it, an idea began to form. He had contacts, resources, and a network of people who could help. Perhaps he could offer her a chance to start over, to rebuild her life the way she deserved. The next day, James called his assistant, Claire, and told her to set up a meeting with a few of his business contacts. He explained that he wanted to help someone who had been important in his life, but he couldn't reveal the details yet. Claire agreed, understanding his need for privacy. That evening, James found himself back in the kitchen, where Mrs. Thompson was preparing dinner. Her quiet movements, the way she folded the napkin and set the table, reminded him of the teacher who had shaped his childhood, the woman who had helped him see the world in a new light. "Mrs. Thompson," James said, his voice softer than before. She turned to face him, a smile on her lips, though it seemed somewhat distant. "I have a plan. I want to help you start fresh. I can offer you a job in my company, a place where you can do something you love." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, James thought she might refuse. But to his surprise, she just shook her head slowly. "I appreciate the offer, James. Truly. But I can't accept." James frowned, taken aback. "Why not? You deserve a second chance." Mrs. Thompson lowered her gaze and hesitated before speaking. "I've already tried so many things, and I keep failing. Maybe I'm just meant to live this life. I'm not the woman I once was." James stepped closer to her, his heart full of determination. "You're more than your past, Mrs. Thompson. You've given so much to others. It's your time to receive something in return." Mrs. Thompson sighed, clearly torn. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. "I've made too many mistakes. I've lost everything." James was firm. "Everyone makes mistakes. You can rebuild. I'm offering you the chance to try again, and you don't have to do it alone." For a long time they stood in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. James knew this wouldn't be easy, and he understood if Mrs. Thompson didn't want to take the offer. But he had made up his mind. He couldn't watch her continue to suffer when he had the power to help. Just as he was about to speak again, Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her face softening. "I don't know what to say, James. No one has ever offered me something like this before." James smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything right now. Take some time to think about it, but know that the offer stands, whenever you're ready." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, her eyes filled with emotions she couldn't quite express. James could see the hesitation in her, but also the flicker of hope that had long been buried deep inside her heart. As James left the room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was a step in the right direction. But he knew that there was more to this story, more to Mrs. Thompson's past, and more he needed to do. The next day, he started putting plans into motion. He reached out to a few trusted business partners, explaining that he was looking for a mentor for a new position within his company, a mentor who had experience, wisdom, and a passion for teaching. At the same time, he quietly set up meetings with financial experts, making sure that Mrs. Thompson wouldn't have to worry about money while she got back on her feet. It was a big step, but it was a start. James hoped that these actions would show her that he wasn't just making empty promises. He genuinely wanted to change her life for the better. But as he awaited her decision, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Mrs. Thompson's story than she was willing to share. What had happened in her past that made her so reluctant to accept help? James knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was determined to be there for her every step of the way. The millionaire who had once been a student was now the one offering support. James continued to make plans for Mrs. Thompson, arranging everything with the best intentions. He wanted to offer her a fresh start, but there was a nagging feeling inside him that something was missing. He needed to know more about her story. What had led her to this point? Over the next few days, he kept a close eye on her. Mrs. Thompson continued to work diligently in the house, quietly taking care of everything. But there was a certain sadness in her eyes, an unspoken weight that James couldn't ignore. It seemed like there was something she wasn't sharing, something from her past that she was hiding. One evening, as James walked into the living room, he saw Mrs. Thompson sitting by the window, looking out at the city lights. Her face was calm, but he could tell she was lost in thought. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, his voice breaking the silence. "I want to help you, but I think I need to understand more about your story. If you're ready to share it, I'm here." She didn't turn to him immediately, and for a few moments he thought she might refuse. But then slowly she looked up at him. Her eyes were filled with vulnerability, something James had never seen before. "I don't know if I can talk about it," she said softly. "It's hard for me." James nodded, showing that he understood. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready. But I want you to know that I'm not just offering you a job or a chance. I'm offering you my trust. I want to help you, no matter what you've been through." She looked at him for a long moment, then seemed to take a deep breath. "When I was younger, I made some bad choices. I married a man who wasn't good for me, and I spent years trying to make it work. But in the end, I lost everything. My home, my family, and eventually my dignity." James felt his heart ache as she spoke. He had no idea that she had gone through so much. It was clear that her past had shaped who she was today, but it was also clear that she had so much more to offer. "I didn't know how to start over," she continued. "I was too ashamed of my past. I didn't think anyone would want to help me, and I was afraid of being judged. So I just kept going from place to place, trying to survive. I never let anyone get too close, not even my students. I wanted to protect them from seeing the real me." James was stunned by her honesty. He had no idea that she had carried such a burden for so long. "You don't have to carry that weight anymore, Mrs. Thompson. You're not alone. I want to help you rebuild, but you have to believe in yourself too." Her eyes welled up with tears, and James could see that the floodgates had opened. She hadn't just been hiding from him, she had been hiding from herself. "I don't know how to trust anyone again," she whispered. James gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to trust everything all at once, but take the first step. Let me help you. You don't have to be alone in this." Mrs. Thompson wiped away a tear, and for the first time in a long while, James saw a hint of hope in her eyes. She was finally starting to believe that things could be different. In the days that followed, James continued to support her, offering her the opportunity to take on the new job within his company. But he also made sure to give her time and space to heal. He knew that her journey wasn't going to be easy, and that it would take time for her to fully trust him. But as he watched Mrs. Thompson begin to take small steps toward a new life, James couldn't help but feel proud. The woman who had once been a teacher to him was now finding the courage to open a new chapter. And though the road ahead would be filled with challenges, James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face them alone. Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Thompson started adjusting to her new life. She was no longer the quiet, withdrawn woman she had once been. She began to smile more often, even laugh on occasion. James noticed the change, but he also saw that there was still something she wasn't fully letting go of. The past, despite her progress, still seemed to haunt her. One evening, as they both worked late into the night, James overheard her on the phone in the hallway. She was speaking softly, but the tension in her voice was unmistakable. It was a conversation that James wasn't supposed to hear, but his curiosity got the better of him. "I can't do this anymore," Mrs. Thompson whispered. "I've tried so hard to bury the past, but it's still there. Every time I think I'm moving forward, something pulls me back. I don't know if I can ever truly escape." James felt a pang of sympathy for her, but also a growing sense of urgency. He couldn't stand seeing her struggle, especially when she had worked so hard to move past it. He had given her the opportunity, but now it seemed she needed more than just a new job or a second chance. She needed closure. The next day, he decided it was time to take action. He arranged for Mrs. Thompson to meet with a counselor, someone who could help her sort through the pain and the memories that still lingered. It was clear to him that she needed professional help to move on. When James told her about the counselor, Mrs. Thompson hesitated at first. "I'm not sure," she said, looking down. "I've always thought I could handle things on my own. I didn't want to burden anyone with my problems." But James was firm. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm offering you a chance to heal, and you don't need to feel ashamed of asking for help. Please take this opportunity." Mrs. Thompson looked at him for a long moment, and then for the first time nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll go." The counseling sessions began, and though it wasn't easy for her, Mrs. Thompson started to open up. She spoke about her failed marriage, the guilt she felt for not being able to make it work, and the years of regret that followed. Slowly, she let go of the anger and bitterness that had consumed her for so long. James watched her transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. It wasn't just about giving her a job or offering her a new life. It was about giving her the tools to rebuild herself from the inside out. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Thompson continued to grow stronger. She began to trust more, not just in James, but in herself. And though she still carried the weight of her past, it was no longer a burden that controlled her every step. One evening, as James and Mrs. Thompson stood by the window, watching the sunset, she turned to him with a smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never thought I would feel this way again. Happy, hopeful." James smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "You did all the hard work. You just needed someone to believe in you." As the sky turned dark, James knew that this was just the beginning of her journey. There would be more challenges ahead, but now Mrs. Thompson had the strength to face them, and James would be there every step of the way. But little did they both know, there was still one more twist in her past that was waiting to be uncovered, something that could either make or break all the progress she had made. One evening, weeks after Mrs. Thompson had made significant progress, a letter arrived for her. It was from her ex-husband. She hadn't heard from him in years, and just seeing the envelope in her hands made her heart race. She had mixed feelings. Part of her wanted to tear it up and forget about the past, but another part of her felt a need to know what he had to say. James noticed the change in her as she held the letter. "Do you want me to open it for you?" he offered gently. Mrs. Thompson looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." James nodded, understanding. "It's your decision, but you don't have to face it alone." After a few moments of silence, she took a deep breath and slowly opened the letter. As she read the words, her face remained unreadable. She sat quietly for a while, processing the letter's contents. The letter wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't an apology, nor was it filled with anger or bitterness. It was simply an invitation. Her ex-husband wanted to meet her again, not to pick up where they left off, but to apologize and try to make amends for the pain he had caused her all those years ago. James stood by her side, waiting quietly, knowing that the choice to meet him was hers alone. She had come so far, and now it seemed like a moment of reckoning. Finally, Mrs. Thompson folded the letter carefully and placed it down on the table. She took a deep breath and smiled at James, her eyes filled with clarity. "I'm not the same person I was when I left him," she said softly. "I'm stronger now. I don't need his apology to heal, because I've already healed." James smiled warmly, proud of how far she had come. "That's the most important thing." Mrs. Thompson walked away from the letter, leaving it behind. The past no longer had the power to hurt her. She had found peace within herself, and that was all that mattered. As time went on, Mrs. Thompson continued her work, finding purpose and happiness in the life she was now building. She wasn't defined by her past mistakes, nor by the people who had hurt her. She was finally free. James, seeing the woman she had become, knew that their journey together wasn't over. He had helped her rebuild her life, but in doing so, he had learned something too. He had learned the power of compassion, patience, and belief in someone when they could not believe in themselves. And as the years passed, both James and Mrs. Thompson would always remember the night when the millionaire opened the door to a woman who had once been lost but had found herself again. Together, they had rewritten her story. In the end, they both realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the belief that they can be more than they ever thought possible. Thank you for joining us on this Heartline journey. Sometimes things aren't what they seem. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more surprises.